Hello, I'm Philip Stoten. I'm here at Apex 2020 and I'm joined by Chintan from CalcuQuote and Bill Cardoso from Creative Electron. The format of the Scoop Show is really just to figure out what's going on in the industry, what you guys have seen in the last couple of days, what's challenging, what's frustrating you, those kind of things. And I want to open with, since we're in this kind of 2020 year and we're looking at kind of visions of the future, what do you see as the biggest opportunities for this industry in the future, and what do you see as the biggest challenge or the biggest hurdle to get over? I'm going to start with you, Bill.
So yesterday we had an interesting workshop, and the title of the workshop was Data as the Currency of the Industry 4.0, the Factory of the Future. And one of the main challenges that we saw in the audience in we EMS companies is not data acquisition, but what you do with the data.
Yeah.
Right. So data right now, raw data, like the data that we generate in our X-ray machines, for the most part, stays inside an X-ray machine. And similarly with AOI, SPI, and other ICT and other inspection techniques we have. So I think one of the main challenges, which is also a great opportunity, is how to bubble up the data, the raw data, process it, and deliver to decision makers in a concise and productive and efficient way. Of course, there's a lot of conversations and communication protocols being developed, but I think there's still quite a bit of opportunity because every time we talk about new processes and new technologies, there's the gap to serve the install base.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the main opportunities we have for the next few years.
Yeah, so it's that industrial IoT. It's a blessing and a curse because it creates lots of opportunities to add value, and what you're doing is a great example of that. But first, we've got to get past this initial hurdle of transforming the factory. Is that something you see, Chintan?
Yeah, I think to your first part of the question, I think the trend that I see is everybody wants things faster, cheaper, and better. And being able to do that starts with, well, what are you going to do to make all three of those things happen at once? And the only answer to that is technology and standardization, right? So the opportunity is being able to accomplish faster, cheaper, better. The way that I think we get there is solving the problem of standardization of data. So if data as a currency or that's going to be a thing, it has to be something that can be transmitted from one silo to another in a seamless fashion so that it can reach the decision maker. And it's not only within a factory, it's not only within a company enterprise-wide, but it's actually transmitting across the supply chain that way. It's transmitting to your customer that way. So being able to seamlessly transfer bill of material and build information up to your supply chain, and being able to get information coming back from your suppliers to say this is the package type and we all call it the same thing. And it's that kind of stuff is going to be really the opportunity. Whoever can map those things the best, I think will be really successful coming forward.
Yeah, and I kind of agree, and I absolutely agree with the data as the currency. But as you say, the people that can break down those silos and can map just a little bit beyond the way we think are going to be winners. We tend to have got very focused in Smart Factory on the machines and the factory floor. But there's way more beyond that. And when you look at what you do in terms of inspection, in some ways that should be impacting on design, and it should be taking data from design. Sometimes it can impact on materials and inventory and all those things. Are we guilty of being locked away in our own little sector and not thinking beyond that?
I think in a way we are, right? We tend to specialize and look, with a very small focus in called expertise, right? Focus is everything. So, and I think we are guilty of that. And one of the, when you talk, think about this zoomed out vision, this more holistic view of the SMT line of the overall process, including inventory control, material management, all the way to a relationship with your customers. When you zoom out, you realize that there's lots of challenges, right? One of them is the fact that you have silos, and companies making those boxes don't necessarily want that data to be standard, right? Data is valuable. Data is, especially as you get deeper into the analytics and how the algorithms are developed, it's a lot of intellectual property there. A lot of the hardware now became a commodity. So more of our intellectual property has shifted towards software development algorithms. So it's something has to break that chasm. Something has to happen to push companies towards standardization. The question that I have is, who's going to be that driver, right? Because if you look around, EMS companies have the need to, need towards the smart factory for different reasons.
Yeah.
It can be an efficiency driver. It can be a labor driver. In fact, you don't have people to work in your lines. And some of these drivers are conflicting, right? So as a result, if you look at the equation from the customer side, there's also not a unique front to drive that standardization, right? So as we see today, it feels like we're circling the airport, right?
Yeah.
Just hovering, waiting for something to happen before one of the parts steps up, executes, or pushes the other for execution, and then we can move towards the smart factory.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, and I think that building block of connectivity is huge, and we've maybe talked a little bit too much about that, but I've kind of floated the idea this week with a few people of connectivity for free, and people have looked very distressed when I've mentioned that to them, and I think there's a kind of fear there, because as you say, there's some intellectual property, people are gaining an additional value, but I think until we can get to the point where we take connectivity as for granted as we take electricity within our machine design, within the way we operate, then we're putting a barrier in front of ourselves and making it more difficult. Chintan, when you're looking at that from the supply chain, do you think there's progress being made there, or do you think the supply chain side is actually lagging the factory floor?
No, I think there's definitely progress. So, if you compare it from 5 years ago versus today, I mean, most of the major distributors are doubling down their investment on being able to make their data more freely available, right? So they are actually taking steps to say, please use this data, because we can only sell to you what you know we can sell to you. And so it makes sense in that there's a proper incentive to say, consume our data, because by consuming our data, you're making more informed decisions about who you want to work with. So yeah, especially, if you break out of those silos, I think it definitely helps. The other thing I'd say is the limited data makes it to where you build such an expertise on this one thing. It's like to a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? But that's the broader your data perspective, the better it starts to look. So I'd say in the supply chain, what we're starting to see is people really looking for best practices and things like that. So how are we going to coalesce? Because we're not doing anybody any favors by saying, we're going to call something inches and the other person's going to call it IN, and now the two can't map together, and it's going to be a problem for everybody. So there is definitely that. It's in everybody's best interest to start coalescing around some standards and things like that.
Yeah, and the inches thing's a great example, because somebody might think it's millimeters, and then suddenly everything's going wrong. When you look at the way we look at things, and we are too narrow, I wonder if trade shows like this are a good example, because the semiconductor industry, the OSAT industry, the PCB industry, they're becoming much more and more connected, but we find ourselves going to these trade shows where we're just looking at basically the SMT line and not looking beyond it. Does that restrict us in our thinking, do you think, in terms of the way we develop solutions?
I think it restricts in one way, but on the other hand, we are seeing more of this cross-link of experiences, right? And what I think what we've discussed in the past is how the boundaries between the shows is getting fuzzier and thinner and thinner, even CES, right? If you go to CES today in Apex or CMT International, you start seeing even companies there
both.
And here, right? One of the main teams for CES this year, artificial intelligence, right? And it's interesting, not artificial intelligence as something in the future, it's now. It's now, it's fact complete. So I think as we progress and as some of these major transformative technologies are permeating through our lives, we're going to see more and more the lines getting fuzzier between these different trade shows and disciplines, right?
And that's really interesting because as someone that visits our trade shows but also CES, I keep making this analogy between, and I want to ask you if you both agree with this, between smart factory and smart city. I look at all the infrastructure requirements, the connectivity requirements for a smart city and a smart factory and think, okay, well, a smart city is maybe a really complicated version of a smart factory, but the requirements are still the same, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, you have to track data points from probably, in a city, it's the geographic expansion and things like that makes it even harder, but it's all data at the end of the day, and you've got all these different pieces of hardware that you're tracking and all these different inputs and outputs that you're, trying to bring together in a way that you can manage the whole thing from happening. So yeah, I think there is a lot of parallels. I was going to address the comment you had made just a second about, everybody's looking at the SMT lines in a big trade show like this, and I was talking to a customer earlier today, and it was like, everybody focuses on the 2 minutes you're going to save per board on the SMT, but there is a broader, more holistic vision you can take to this where you're setting up all these things, and if you consider the data flow just, of the components going forward into a BOM, into the programming of the machine, that's where a lot of the time goes too, especially if you're an NPI and things like that. So I think between smart city and smart factory, there's definitely connections, but it's really the factory does more than just build, it also plans to build, and there's more to it.
But so there's that old saying, right? You can't manage what you don't measure. So it's the fact that we look at those 2 minutes because that is the process we're measuring, right? So we can manage the 2 minutes while everything else you do on the back end and the front end are actually not measuring.
It's all overhead.
It's all overhead, right? It goes into a bucket. And that's, I think, one of the critical things as we move forward towards integration is the realization of this complexity, right? And then taking advantage of new, modern software systems that can help us measure. And once we measure, you can start managing, because you can save 2 minutes here, but you just waited half an hour somewhere else, right?
Right.
Yeah, and I think that's fascinating because you get to that point where there's so much data, there's so much complexity, there's so many different voices that should influence the line, and you might be working ridiculously hard to save a couple of minutes on changeover, which might happen 10 times a day. You've saved 20 minutes. If a counterfeit component because they haven't got counterfeit inspection reaches the floor, that's going to stop the line for a lot longer. If a component isn't there when it's needed because they haven't done their inventory management properly, again, a much, much bigger impact, but they know what they can measure. And I was talking to guys in the supply chain about the coronavirus, and they're saying the lack of preparedness for these kind of disruptions is exactly for that reason. Most supply chain managers are measured on how much money they save in a quarter on their bill of materials, not the bumps and the problems, which can cost way more than knocking a cent off a few components.
Yeah, it's funny actually. One of the things that we deal with often is, purchase price variance is a metric every buyer is very familiar with, but what doesn't get measured as much is number of full-time employees per dollar spent or something like that, right? And that's a very relevant metric because that's contributing to your bottom line just as much in a lot of cases. So I think there are, you have to measure certain things, and if you look at something like supply chain disruptions, part of the problem is everybody has stretched it so thin now, right? The supply chain's gotten tighter, the expectations of when something needs to be ready has gotten tighter. So all of that stuff has gotten stretched to the point where a minor disruption in another part of the world now all of a sudden has a huge impact, and you're still focusing on the thing that you're measuring, which is purchase price variance, but what happened to the 3 weeks of delay now you've experienced?
Yeah, and that can be the difference between a product being successful and unsuccessful. Last point on that, I think you then have is you have to take a very holistic approach to data. You have to use a huge amount of data. There is therefore too much data. You have to protect users from complexity. Is AI the only solution to managing that data?
I think AI is one solution, one of the possible options, right? And a very powerful option to manage that data complexity. But I think the first step is to understand how we're going to collect the data, how we're going to make the data safe and reliable, and you can assess. Because one of the going back to smart factory and smart city, we all talk about, let's collect the data, let's make sure all the data is collected, the IoT, and then at the end of the day, there's always that person that asks, and where are we going to store all this data?
Yeah.
Right? So,
Which is its own problem.
It's
Yeah.
its own problem, right? Now you're going to put a data center at the end of every SMT line because you're collecting terabytes of data per hour. You know, so it's a problem that I think it's very healthy. We're talking about it. These are very important discussions you have. Like Chintan said, you know, when you stretch, we talk about stretching the supply chain thin today because we have disruption. You know, before the disruption, it's called optimizing the efficiency of the supply chain. It's the same outcome, right?
Yeah.
With very different perspectives depending on any glitches we have in the supply chain.
Yeah, that's right. And all those just-in-time strategies and all those lean manufacturing strategies with as little stock as possible suddenly become a problem.
Yeah, and to the question of like the AI, so we have kind of a funny experience with this. So we have a big team of developers that is working on using machine learning and things like that as part of data cleansing. And we had a hackathon, and we said, hey guys, build whatever you want, but you have to apply a machine learning algorithm to this process. And you know, they came up with all kinds of things like, well, you should be able to, it should recognize your speech when you speak a manufacturer part number. But who's going to ever speak a manufacturer? It's a problem not worth solving, right? It's a solution looking for a problem. And so I think to your point, I mean, artificial intelligence, machine learning can do a lot, but you got to start with what's the question, what's the problem, and then let's solve it rather, because their possibilities are pretty limitless, but it's not a magic thing that all of a sudden solves a problem. You got to start with the problem.
Yeah, you have, absolutely. And you know, it comes back to something that someone said to me yesterday was, just because we can, it doesn't mean we should. And that's always a concern with engineers and with technologists. Guys, fantastic conversation, really interesting. I know we could go on much longer, but we should probably wrap up there. Thanks so much for your time.